time no see.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, good to see you.
And Zhu Min, where's Zhu Min?
Okay, Zhu Min-san.
Okay, we need a few minutes for Zhu Min.
Zhu Min-san.
Oh, he's there. He's there.
He's there.
Is he? Okay. Oh, let's start. Thank you, everybody, and it's an honor for me to be invited to chair this panel. We just heard the last panel, which was very interesting. It was on Asia-Pacific security, and there were lots of debates and conclusions too. Interesting ending, as Professor Yan Jietong summed it up. I first would like to thank Professor Yan Jietong and his excellent team, which has made this discussion possible in spite of the pandemic. I understand that we are the last panel, and after us, it will be the closing event. This peace conference has traveled across the world online. I think actually this is even better, isn't it, Susan?
It is. It's great. It's great.
We can do it.
Except it's very early here.
Oh, is it? Okay. But we can do it without traveling, without taking all the trouble. Today we have some very important panelists. We have Kevin Roth, who was Prime Minister of Australia, and now he's the President of Asia Society Policy Institute. And we have Mr. Zhu Min, who was once the Deputy Managing Director of IMF, and now he's heading the National Institute of Financial Research of Tsinghua University. And we have Susan Shirk, my old friend, who was once Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of the United States. And now she's chairing the 21st Century China Center in the U.S. And we have Professor Wang Jisi from Beijing University, who is President of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies of Peking University. The panel theme for today is China-U.S. relations in a post-pandemic era, or maybe rather during the pandemic. The world had a strong expectation for China-U.S. to work together during the pandemic, but didn't happen. Instead, the relationship between China-U.S. is getting worse. I just published actually a long article on News China today, and I was arguing that it was unfortunate that the China-U.S. was not able to work together. One of the reasons is probably the U.S. administration, or some people in the U.S. administration, is more interested in a strategic competition with China than in collaboration with China against the pandemic. But on the other hand, I see that China-U.S. both have the two countries also share the responsibility of maintaining peace and promoting global growth and cooperation. So with this, with the problems with the worsening relationship and worsening atmosphere, where the relationship is heading for, and what is the prospect, and what are needed to be done by the two countries and by the makers in the two countries, and how it's going to impact the world. I think these are the questions people want to hear from our panelists. The rule is that our panelists have 10 minutes, no more than 15 minutes, to make a keynote speech. And then I hope you can leave a little bit more time for interaction. We have a very big follower Professor Yan Shuitong attract lots of people following his event. So I'm sure lots of people want to ask you questions. Now we can start hearing from our panelists. Let's start from Kevin Roth. Kevin?
Well, good evening from Australia. It's nearly 11 p.m. here. I see it's not quite 6 a.m. in Southern California, Susan, so I don't know whether you're in the worst position or I'm in the worst position. It depends whether you're a morning person or an evening person. But if I don't survive through to the end of this and you see me quietly slip away, it's through no disrespect. It's just quite late here. Secondly, my thanks to Yan Shuitong for persevering with the idea of the World Peace Forum when the world is becoming less and less peaceful, but particularly at a time when peace is now, shall we say, an open question between China and the United States for the first time in more than half a century. So that makes this gathering, I think, particularly relevant. The third introductory point I'd simply make is this, that I don't intend in my allocated 10 or 15 minutes to provide a long elaboration of what I think the post-COVID international order will look like and the roles of the United States and China within it. For those who are interested, I've written on this in Foreign Affairs magazine in the United States about a month or so ago, and my arguments are fairly clear. COVID-19 damages the United States, both in terms of its real power and its reputational standing. It also damages China, its real power and its reputational standing. And it also results in a weaker global order and a drift towards what I describe in the article as increasing levels of international anarchy. That is a dysfunctional multilateral system. But I intend to leave those arguments to one side for my allocated time here this evening and simply focus on one question, and it's a real-time question, and that is the question of Taiwan, which lies at the center right now of the strategic relationship between China and the United States. In many respects, it has never moved from that position since Henry Kissinger first sat down with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai back in 1971. But it's back again in force. So my five sets of points in my remarks now are primarily focused on the Taiwan question because I believe it to be important. Point number one is we have Yang Jiechi and Secretary of State Pompeo reportedly meeting in Hawaii on the 17th of June. That's today. I haven't yet seen anything that's emerged from all of that, but I think it's a very important meeting objectively. We could have a long discussion about the deterioration of the US-China relationship over the last number of years. We could go back to a decade and look at the pivot and the reasons for America's decision to deploy the pivot. We could go back to the US national security strategy of President Trump's in 2017. We could go to the US-China trade war, and we could go to the further deterioration in relationship during the COVID crisis over the last 6 months. But I don't think they are particularly the reasons why the Yang Jiechi Pompeo meeting is so important. I think there are three core reasons why that meeting is important. The number one is the US-China relationship from an objective analytical point of view, what you would describe as a 客观的现实，不是主观方面的, is that it is in the worst state it's been in half a century. Number two, I think practically all of the political and diplomatic insulation covering around this relationship, which has been built up over the last half a century, has now been stripped away. it is very raw, R-A-W, raw. And thirdly, you don't have to work for the Central Military Commission in Beijing or the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., or for PACOM or Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu to observe that the pattern of military activity, military and naval and air activity in and around Taiwan, both on the part of China and the United States, has been increasing sharply in very recent weeks. And therefore, my first point is we need to apply in this conference razor-sharp focus on this question, particularly for the weeks ahead and certainly for the 6 months ahead through until the end of this year. My second point, therefore, is to simply commend Yang Jiechi and Mike Pompeo for taking the political decision to meet. It's not convenient in either side's domestic politics to do so at this time. We all know what the atmosphere is in Washington towards China. It's universally negative, Republican and Democrat. And similarly in Beijing, the attitude towards Washington is very difficult as well. So therefore, I'd commend both these senior cabinet officials for their courage in meeting. I think it's important that they do so. But there's a reason why it's important to do so, which brings me to my third point, and that is neither side wants to end up in a military conflict by accident. Neither side wants to generate a crisis which could lead to escalation, which could lead to a military conflict. And neither side wants to have uncontrolled escalation should a crisis emerge. And therefore, the only way for that to be avoided is for the most senior cabinet officials from both sides responsible for political and military affairs to meet and to have direct exchanges. We all know the history of international relations, and the history of international relations, whether it's in the Pacific or the Atlantic, whether it's in Asia or in Europe or elsewhere, is littered with the carcasses of failed management of crises, failed management of escalation. We do not want that to happen now. But if there is a clear principle which emerges through the lens of diplomatic history and political history, it is usually when escalation is occurring or when crises are unfolding that the players contemporaneously are often not aware where they are actually located in the crisis. In other words, it's moving too fast for them to have objective consciousness of what is happening around them. I believe there are some on both sides of this dispute, both in Washington and Beijing, who do have this objective awareness that there is a real set of dangers which lie ahead on the Taiwan question in the weeks and months ahead. Which brings me to my fourth point. We could have a long discussion here about whether we are now in what I've written in my article, Cold War 1.5, on the way to Cold War 2.0, what stage of economic decoupling we are in, or whether global supply chains can be reconstituted, whether financial decoupling can be avoided, and can technological decoupling be managed or quarantined to particular technology categories. Those are important debates all in themselves. But I do believe they are smaller debates than the central debate about how we manage this central question of Taiwan. Which brings me to my fifth and final point, Fu Ying, which is it is imperative that both sides, and hopefully beginning with the Yang Jiechi and Mike Pompeo meeting, use this opportunity through rational, high-level, eyeball-to-eyeball discussion to begin to exchange clear, mutual understandings about where each other's real red lines on Taiwan lie. It is a problem when both sides forget where the other side's red lines are. It is critical in a crisis that red lines are reasserted and reasserted clearly, confidentially, and diplomatically. It is wrong, and diplomatic history teaches us, to simply rely on, let's call it diplomatic, let alone military signaling. We need to have clear-cut communications about red lines. Remember, even when we had a full-blown Cold War, 1.0 between the United States and the then Soviet Union, there was a clear understanding, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, about where each side's red lines did lie, helping to avoid direct military crises between them in the ensuing decades. So therefore, I conclude my remarks, Fu Ying, by saying I don't wish to be a destroyer of the academic party here. I simply wish to bring people back to a razor-sharp focus on the core issue in the US-China relationship right now, leaving aside all the atmospherics, all the language, all the who's to blame for COVID-19 and who's not to blame, back to where we've got to, which is this core question of pragmatically dealing with the Taiwan question so that we do not end up in conflict by accident. And my two footnotes at the end are, let us do so in a way which keeps at least the military-to-military lines of communication fully open between the Central Military Commission and Pacific Command and the Pentagon. And secondly, at a different level, keep the two lines of communication open between the US Federal Reserve and the People's Bank of China. That's where a currency war, or let's call it a financial war, could begin, unless again there is clear signaling of red lines to each side. Hawaii is an interesting venue to have this meeting, Fu Ying. We know that Hawaii and Honolulu were, shall we say, significant in the history of politics and security and peace in the 20th century. Let's hope that this meeting in Hawaii on this occasion has a happier set of outcomes as far as Taiwan is concerned. Back to you, Fu Ying.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Every time listening to Kevin, I can't help admiring the depths of his knowledge of China and the knowledge he commands of the United States. So I really appreciate your suggestions, especially on Taiwan. There is a law in place on the part of China about the red line, about what China, where China stands as far as Taiwan issue is concerned. I do agree with you. I think it's important that the two parties, especially the U.S., be aware of the sensitivity of this issue. Shall we move on to Mr. Zhu Min?
Yeah, thank you, Madame Fu Ying, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to join this session and say a few words on these very, very important issues. The topics about post-pandemic U.S.-China relationship. I think this is the most important thing. There are so many things both countries can do, should do, to improve the global peace status and the prosperities. But very unfortunately, the relationship, as Madame Fu Ying just mentioned in her opening remark, and also Kevin mentioned, is deteriorating. So it's a very sad situation. I think we all should work together and work hard to prevent the relationship deteriorating and try to see, whether the real things we can do, we can work. I think Kevin properly put the bottom line, so you have to understand where's the red line. I would like to point to three things, I think, in this current situation and the post-pandemic situations. We both should work together, and also we should start dialogue to see whether we can improve the global peace situation and improve the global economic and financial situation as well. So the 3 points I would like to make is, I think the first issues on global public health issue. I think today we have more than 8 million people infected, right? More than 420 people died because COVID-19. So COVID-19 is still on exponentially increase rates, right? So this is a real global challenge. It's alive. So the first is really vaccines. So research on vaccines and manufacturing, distribution is the most important thing for today for the whole world. There are more than 100 teams working on those things. I think that's good news. But it looks very clear because it takes a long time. And if we cannot get this vaccine in 12 to 24 months, more people will die. So we need the global cooperation. And China also leads. China have 5 teams working on the vaccines and also made quite a good progress and do the second the test now, and willing to working with the whole world. I think the both countries, China and the U.S., I think are in the leading position to encourage to bring the teams, the scientists, the doctors, and companies, private sectors, and together on vaccines. And also more and more countries decline if the vaccines seem to be founded and made it. It should be a global public good. I think China made that commitment. I think more countries should make that commitment. So when the vaccines are there, they should deliver to the people in need. I think those are also very important things. And the whole manufacturing and distribution is another big issue. We should start working now to think about how can we globally manufacture and distribute things. I think those are very important things. But they're more than that. Currently, how do you build a good public health system? I think is the most important challenge for every country. If you see what happened in the U.S., what happened in even Europe, in the many countries, particularly now in the emerging market, low-income country, every country needs equipment and need medical supplies. For example, everybody talk about the ventilator machines. The machine composed 1,500 parts involving 14 companies and in 14 countries. China accounts only 20% of the global market, but so many countries request China provide a machine to them, equipment to them. China cannot lift the capacity because it's a whole supply chain. So it's really need a global efforts. I think China and the U.S. both are key players in this particular machine supply chains. Until we can work together, we'll not be able to expand the capacity for it's a really that needed machine who saves life every day. So I think that's the one typical case to show how important and we need to work together. And in those days, we just cannot move the PPE and the medical supplies across board smoothly and easily because the lockdown, because the policy. So I think the world should work together, make sure the PPE and the medical supplies will be able to across the board freely, zero tax, or with the express pass with a very easy customer sort of layers. So make sure those PPE and medical supplies things will be able to send to the place the country and the people most needed, which require a very important degree of a global cooperation, and both China and U.S. are obligated to that. I think that those are very important things. I mean, at this moment, everybody talk about concern about the possible second wave of the pandemic comeback. And so this is the window opportunity for every country to work to expand their public health system. I think in this moment, and a global cooperation makes sure the medical equipment and the medical supplies can move easily across the board. I think those are the most important and urgent need first thing. The second, because the economy is in such a bad shape. So every country have a reopening policy. When you do the reopening, what do you need? You really need to let the people and the goods to move. Now, when you let the people and the goods to move to across the board, you really need to build a system. The system I call TTTT, which is test, tracking, tracing, and treatment. And we need to build a common standard to allow the people and the goods across the board easily, which once again require global cooperation. And I think the U.S. and China is really important to lead these efforts until we have a global standard to allow the goods and the people to move across the board, until we have a globally meaningful TTTT system with an agile and a smart system to support, I don't think we'll be able to reopen the global economy. So this is another big issue, and we need to work together. And the third issues I would like to mention is also in my area when we talk about economic recovery, which is more about trade, about supply chain, about technology. Today, the IMF was forecasting the global will have a negative 3% GDP shrink this year. Roughly a month later, World Bank just a few days says the global GDP will shrink 5.6%. So clearly things are deteriorating, economic situation. And the trade will shrink even more. The various forecasting from roughly 11% from IMF to 30% of WTO. If trade drops 30%, I don't think any chance the global will have a good, healthy, and a strong economic recovery. So trade recovery is the most important thing. When we promote trade recovery, we need to support the supply chain to back to the function, to make sure the global supply chain work together, to make sure, to make sure the technology move freely across the board. I think between the U.S. and China, the sad things, May 20, U.S. announced the tech policy against Huawei. I think this is really not only hurting the company of Huawei, but it really leaves a big scar on global tech sectors. So that means every tech company have to have the second line to prepare the war situations. And the market will be divided into the two systems. I think that will be a very difficult system to global economy to recover. So in that situations, we need to support the supply chain to work and in a more effective way. We need to support the technology IP and the tech products move freely across the board, and we need to support trade flow. I think those are the most important things. So in that sense, given there was a trade friction between the US and China, which very unfortunately lasted for so long, and also fortunately signed the deal earlier this year, and the number so far was not very good, but both sides are really strongly committed to deliver that first phase trade deal, I think, which is very good, very positive. So now both sides need to move forward from trade to supply chain and to technology side. And I'm very much hope the talk between Mr. Yang and Mr. Pompeo in Hawaii will cover this very important issue on the trade, supply chain, and technology. Because it's really not only for China and the U.S., but for the whole world. So I think overall, I used up my 10 minutes to conclude. I think the relationship is deteriorating, but world really urgently need both China and U.S. play the leading role in this very, very difficult time. And we need to pick at least a few very, very important issues, both importantly for both China and the U.S., but also for the whole world, to have a constructive conversation and to start to move forward to solve those issues. So I'll stop here. Thank you once again for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you, Zhu Min, for your very thorough analysis of the challenges we are confronting and very important suggestions. Shall we now hear Mrs. Susan Shirk? Professor Susan Shirk.
Well, I'd like to, first of all, thank Professor Yan and Fu Ying for giving me the honor of participating in the Peace Forum today. It's really wonderful. It's my first time speaking at the Peace Forum, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Much of what I wanted to say echoes what Kevin Rudd has said, and especially what Zhu Min has said. U.S.-China relations has failed the test of the COVID pandemic. We had cooperated very well in the past, ever since SARS. We cooperated very well on H1N1, on Ebola. And what really inspires me is that the United States and the Soviet Union, even in the depth of the Cold War, had managed to work together to eradicate smallpox from the world. Now, if they can do it, why can't we do it? This is a classic, as Zhu Min points out, a classic tragedy of the commons. But normally when we talk about tragedy of the commons, we talk about free riding, not making enough effort. In this case, the US and China are actively subverting global collective action by what looks to me to be a lot of playground fights and appearing to be selfishly pursuing their own power and interests at a time when the world is looking for leadership. And as Kevin wrote in his eloquent foreign affairs piece, neither country, China or the United States, has enhanced its reputation for leadership at this time. No one has won. I get so frustrated when journalists call me and ask about, well, what will be the impact of COVID? Does this mean that China will surpass the United States to become the world's superpower? And I don't even want to talk about this question because it seems so irrelevant to the global crisis that we are still in the middle of. So no one has won, everyone has lost. The two countries, people of the two countries, and the people in the rest of the world. Deterioration of relations is very dangerous, not just because of the failure to cooperate on the pandemic, but also the decoupling of our highly integrated economies and societies. Our universities would be tragically costly. The US and China are at the crux of globalization. And if they decouple, we will have deglobalization. In fact, the process appears to be underway. If you look at the data on the decline of global trade and global investment as well. And this is dramatically reducing global growth and welfare. And the people like us here participating in this meeting, who have strong ties in both the United States and China, will certainly suffer personally as well. And how are we going to mend ties when it's so hard for people to get on an airplane and travel across the Pacific? So in that respect, it's definitely a sign of hope to see Pompeo and Yang Jiechi meeting in Hawaii. Maybe this will bring back Hawaii as a place where Asians and the United States meet together. During COVID, we're still in the COVID crisis. Both countries are facing new pressing domestic problems, domestic realities. And people in both countries are going to expect their leaders, politicians, to pay more attention to the problems at home that are directly affecting people's livelihood, people's lives and welfare, rather than talking tough and flexing muscles abroad. I see the public mood is changing because in such a short period of time, so many people have lost their jobs, so many people have died in each of these countries. In the United States, it's the worst economic depression since the 1920s. And we also have massive protests, peaceful protests mostly, in our cities against racism and police brutality. Both countries are facing budget deficits because they've had to engage in massive levels of deficit spending. China is now confronting second wave infections, massive unemployment, zero or minus economic growth, and still persistent large-scale poverty. So these are the things that people actually care about today. And I believe there is a chance for, at least in the United States, for our political leaders to reset relations with China after the November election. I expect that a President Biden approach to China will be practical, not ideological. He'll try to negotiate priority issues instead of using the Trump administration's sledgehammer approach, and preserve space for cooperation on health, climate, and non-proliferation. True, public opinion in the United States has soured dramatically, is very, very negative on China right now. And I hope that the leadership in China will recognize that what people in the United States are most critical of and most worried about in China's actions are its environmental impact, cyber attacks, and human rights policies, ahead of economic issues like jobs or the trade deficit. So I think that the United States, there's a possibility of a reset because the Trump ads on China are simply not working. Support for Trump, President Trump, has declined quite significantly during a period when he's been running these anti-China ads, blaming China for COVID spreading to the United States in several Midwestern states. So I expect that people will be demanding more social spending on healthcare, public health, welfare, jobs, in fact, more spending on military defense. Now, the question is, can China do a reset? China right now faces the possibility of having the same leader in power indefinitely. You've abandoned the regular turnover of power at the top, which was so hard to achieve and such a significant political achievement for the Chinese political system. So how can China now reset its policies? The worldview, there's a tremendous backlash against China's actions right now. There's a view that China's selfishly using this COVID crisis to expand its power and reach. And China's overreaching is provoking a major global backlash. Is the leadership even aware of that? Do they get the message from their advisors? And if they do get the message, are they able to adjust their policies more in line with China's actual national interests? That's the big question that we face now. All of us who study China in the United States have a long list of things that China could do. We recognize the failures of our own current policy. Don't get me wrong. But we also have a long list of what China could do to adjust its own actions, because that's an essential part of the solution. And I don't have time to go through them here. I'd be happy to talk about them in the discussion section. Maybe I'll just conclude by saying bringing the business community back on board would be essential. Stopping the wolf warrior, ridiculous, coercive diplomacy right in the midst of the pandemic is obviously essential. And then third, as Zhu Min said, it would be great to have China, in addition to President Xi's promise to share the vaccine, to actually propose some global arrangements for sharing therapies and vaccines with people throughout the world, whoever needs it most. And let's hope that that's one major topic in Hawaii today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. I understand what's making you frustrated, but your frustration is frustrating me too, because most people in China feel that we are doing everything we can to help other countries. Indeed, we are sending all kinds of equipment to Europe, to U.S. The U.S., I think averaging every American has 40 or 50 face masks from China. But then China is blamed for doing too much. It's reaching out, showing ambitions. So China can never win. So that's frustrating too. But there's no point in complaining. I think it's a learning curve for China too. I think China needs to try to better understand the messages coming back from the world and try to do better. Okay, let's move on to Professor Wang Jisi.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fu Ying, and thank you, Professor Yuan Xietong at Tsinghua University for inviting me. I'm honored to participate in this panel to discuss China-U.S. relations. The heat of summer has arrived in Beijing, and so has the fever in China-U.S. interaction. Looking at the title of our session, I'm not sure whether the post-pandemic era will come anytime soon, or whether any single country can declare total victory over the coronavirus. In the last couple of days, there have been dozens of new infections in Beijing. Universities and schools that were just reopened have been locked down again. The COVID-19 virus appears to be very much defiant against our political instructions. China and the United States, as two strongest powers in the world, should join hands in coping with the pandemic, as Dr. Zhu Min just pointed to. Unfortunately, the reality today is just the opposite. The two countries are blaming each other for spreading out the virus. Even worse, both Beijing and Washington see the other side as a political virus that damages its legitimacy at home and its reputation in the world. Washington's policy toward Beijing seems to be aimed at isolating China in the international community and isolating the Communist Party from the Chinese population. Beijing's reaction is likely to be a tit-for-tat approach. I recently published an article in Global Times in both Chinese and English. The essay argues that three bottom lines should be upheld in China-U.S. relations. First, the two countries must avoid the war, which Kevin Rudd emphasized. Second, we must maintain a certain scale of economic relations and technological engagement and sustain global financial stability. Third, the two countries must keep humanitarian communications and educational exchanges. We should be able to send Peking University students, maybe Tsinghua students as well, to American universities and receive students and faculty from UC San Diego. I'm sure Susan Shirk will agree with me on this point. However, I have to admit that the views in my essay are not popular among Chinese audiences, and my views do not represent the mainstream thinking in China's media. The media here have spared little effort recently to review America's deplorable performance in handling the pandemic. Racial discrimination, police brutality, and social justice shown in the riots and protests around the United States caused by the killing of an Afro-American man have been widely reported in China on daily basis. The decline of U.S. power and influence, the dark side of its society and politics, and its attempts to contain the rise of China do not justify any expression of willingness for China to make compromise to the U.S. A fighting spirit is more needed than a moderate gesture toward America. People tend to draw a comparison between China-U.S. ties today and Soviet-U.S. ties in the Cold War period. In my view, China-U.S. ties today may be even worse than the Soviet-U.S. relationship because the latter was at least cold. Moscow-Washington relations remained essentially stable for more than 4 decades, despite a few sporadic hot moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Those two superpowers were separate from each other politically, economically, and socially, and were actually unable to influence each other's domestic affairs. The contact between Washington and Moscow was rather superficial and involved little love-hate emotion. In contrast, the U.S.-China relationship is now suffering from forceful disengagement after a steady progress in engaging each other for 4 decades. The sentimental and the material losses done by the heated quarrels and grudging decoupling between the two sides, in particular during the pandemic period, are sensationally more distressing than the analogy of the Cold War. One remaining question is whether the China-U.S. rivalry will last longer and cost more on both sides than the Soviet-U.S. competition. Another remaining question is whether an unexpected event alongside the current U.S.-China tensions will escalate into a deadly clash. In the next 4 months until November 3rd, it is almost certain that China policy will be a debating issue in the U.S. presidential election, a presidential campaign. Some Chinese analysts are concerned that the Trump camp may create a few incidents in its China relations within this time frame in order to show its determination to deter China. That could be dangerous. At this delicate moment, Beijing should not provide any ammunition or excuse to Washington that could trigger a crisis. But China has its own domestic priorities, like security in Hong Kong, that may override its consideration of relations with the U.S. A window of opportunity may occur after November 3rd if the majority of U.S. voters take side with the political outlook of Kevin Rudd and Susan Shirk. However, I'm still struggling with myself on the question whether a Democratic administration will hold a China policy remarkably different from that of the current administration. In the post-Cold War era, the two Democratic administrations, Clinton and Obama, carried out a mission-oriented grand strategy, namely to set up missions like economy and security first, and not to identify any specific rivals among major countries. The Republican administrations tend to carry out a threat-oriented strategy. In the eyes of the Bush administration, radical Islamism was regarded as the major threat, and China has now become a principal rival to the Trump administration. What kind of grand strategy the new leadership in Washington in 2021 is going to follow will be crucial to the China-U.S. relationship in the coming years. On the Chinese side, two fundamental drivers have shaped China's strategy toward the United States. The first driver is the material power, in particular economic and military power China has been accumulating. In 1979, China's GDP only accounted for 6.8% of America's. In 2019, China's GDP reached 66% that of America. The popular perception that the U.S. power has been gradually declining, whereas China will succeed the U.S. as number one in the world sooner or later, has diminished the appeal of adhering to Deng Xiaoping's advocacy of keeping a low profile. The second driver is consolidation and the concentration of the power of the Communist Party of China that has been challenged by the United States. Ever since the founding of the PRC in 1949, preserving the leadership of the CPC has been China's central goal in defending its sovereignty and security. And China's economic growth, in large measure, has served this objective. With China reaching out to global economy and for global influence, strategic competition with the United States has to go outside of China's peripheries to cover the whole world. Both drivers preclude the possibility of China yielding to U.S. pressures in important issue areas. In conclusion, it is certain to me that China-U.S. relations, with or without the end of the pandemic era, will continue to deteriorate. The pace and scope of the downward spiral are uncertain. I don't think I can offer any sensible and practical recommendations for stabilizing the bilateral ties. I only hope that people like us participating in this panel discussion will continue to inform each other of where things are moving and get better prepared for future risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we still have about 15 minutes, and it's late for Kevin. Shall we put the first question to Kevin? Kevin, you want to take a question about China-U.S. or China-Australia? There are two questions for you. Kevin, has he gone? Oh, I think he's left. He has retired.
He's tired.
It's quite late there. So let's put the next question to Zhu Min. It's about I think it's from 21st Century Business Herald. It's about first phase trade agreement. What's the impact of the pandemic on the implementation of the agreement? Zhu Min?
Well, I think if you're looking for the number because China agreed when we signed the deal earlier this year, China will import roughly more than 100 billion goods from the United States. So, but in the first quarter, China imported roughly only $700 million energy products, from the United States, which is very low. And China imported roughly 3.6 billion agricultural products from the United States, which is even lower than compared with the same times last year. And on the manufactured goods, Chinese imports also less than China import from the United States last quarter. And obviously, there are real reasons because the COVID-19 and Chinese domestic demand also dropped dramatically. And sometimes U.S. cannot supply the goods as well. And also, for example, the soybean, right, if China import from Brazil, because exchange rate depreciation more than 15%, and the shipping costs drop another 5 to 8%. So it's roughly 20% cheaper, used market principle, right? So all those things cause China import from U.S. It's not as we both expected, when we signed the deal. I think that's the issue. I'll give you a particular case. China import vehicle and auto vehicle from the United States actually drops roughly $1 billion, which is 955 million, roughly around $1 billion. But Chinese domestic market auto sale dropped 42% in the first quarter. Now, if China have no demand, obviously China cannot import vehicles from international market, including the United States. So those are the real things. So looking forward, if China want to reach the goal we settled both in early this year to the end of this year, it will be quite difficult. But I think the good news now, once again, both sides sit down to talk. Vice Prime Minister Liu He and Steve Mnuchin and Lighthouse had a very good conversation. China fully committed to fulfill and implement phase one trade deal, so will increase import from the United States from various goods, assume U.S. can provide the goods, and also U.S. appreciate China's IP protection improvements, financial market openings, and also clearly make Chinese market more open and friendly to the global business community. So add the two things together, I think trade actually, number is not good, but it's not a big issue between U.S. and China.
Okay, thank you. Susan, there are two questions for you. You can choose from one of them. and prepare it while Professor Wang Jisi takes his question. Professor Wang Jisi's question comes from China.com. It's about decoupling. What is China's strategies vis-a-vis this trend of decoupling? And the two questions for Susan, one comes from the Financial Times. I think you don't like that question. It says, will Donald Trump be reelected, and how will this impact Sino-U.S. relations? I heard you when you were speaking, you think Mr. Biden will be winning. So if you don't like that question, you can take this one. It's about NATO. How do you see NATO's new transformation towards China? Because the NATO's secretary said something. Jean Stoltenberg recently, he mentioned that NATO will try to get closer to the allies in East Asia. So Susan, while you prepare for those questions, Professor Wang Jisi may start answering your questions. We have 10 minutes left, please. Professor Wang Jisi, is your mic on? I think you need to, okay.
Oh, okay.
No, it's okay, right.
What's the question to me? The question about decoupling?
Yes, decoupling and China's strategy.
Oh, China's strategy is not decoupling. We are against decoupling, but we also have to think about this. That is, decoupling is not in China's favor, but we also have the strategy of self-reliance and indigenous industrial policy and so on and so forth. So I have to say that we have no other choice but to engage with the United States in many technological issues. As I emphasized in my recent essay, that you have to cooperate with GE to get their aircraft engine. We have to import Boeing aircraft because we need more aircraft in the future. And other suppliers like Airbus cannot satisfy our needs. So we have to engage with the United States, and we have to keep our trade volume at least at the minimum. So I'm not in favor of decoupling, but we know we should produce more industrial goods on China's own to satisfy our own needs.
Well, right. Okay, Susan? Your mic? Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Well, my husband, Sam Popkin, is really the American politics expert in the family. And his prediction was wrong in 2016. So he's lacking confidence in his ability to predict in 2020. So it's hard to say, but I think what is interesting is that during this period when President Trump was really trying to deflect blame from his own performance in handling the COVID epidemic, he launched all of these very tough ads against China, blaming China, stirring up conspiracy theories against China. And they just didn't seem to get that much traction from the public. And of course, we also had Black Lives Matter and large-scale protests in American cities where, again, the president's he didn't act very presidential in the way he handled that outpouring of sentiment over police brutality, but much broader, many other issues of persistent racism in American society. So, there were a lot of things going wrong in the environment, and President Trump's response was very unsatisfactory from the standpoint of, I think it's fair to say, the majority of people in the United States. So the China ploy didn't seem to work very well. And right now, Biden is up, I think, 13, 14 points in the polls. And Joe Biden also got the biggest surge of campaign contributions last month. So it's looking, pretty good for a Biden victory. So I think I'll answer that question because I really haven't been following NATO per se, but I will on the China issue, but I will say, and this is really, really important for the folks in Beijing to be aware of, that the Europeans are very frustrated with Donald Trump. There's no love lost between European leaders and President Trump. They're all doing their best to kind of slow walk any actions in order to just get through November 2020. And they're hoping for a reset in the way the United States works together with allies and friends in the world, rather than this unilateral approach. But on the other hand, at the same time, there's great concern about changes, domestic changes in China, and Chinese foreign policy, Chinese overreaching. And so if you see, for example, these legislators who've created an alliance of politicians from the left and the right coming together to express great concern about the risk to the global rules-based order and democracies coming from China, that's not something that the United States created. That's something that is a genuine backlash among Europeans. So I think this is a big diplomatic challenge to China. And it's also an opportunity to find ways of trying to revive a reputation of China as a responsible global power. It's sad to see because there was a great opportunity after COVID, but hopefully we'll see a change in the style and practice of Chinese foreign policy and diplomacy, just as I hope we see a change in the style and practice of American diplomacy.
Thank you, Susan. I'm impressed when you said that Donald Trump's attempt to blame China is not working. That's very interesting. And obviously, both sides are concerned with each other, and we're concerned of different concerns. So maybe today we don't have time to pursue it further, but I'm really intrigued. I'd like to follow it up. And I think the conversation is very important. If the atmosphere is not so poisoned, if the two sides can have very sober-minded dialogues, it shouldn't be difficult to understand each other and find a way out. Okay, this is a very interesting discussion, but we have, I think we have come to the end of the time given to us, and I could see that Professor Yan Xietung is watching us. They are going to start the closing ceremony. So I want to thank you very much, everybody, and let's continue the dialogue. Thank you. We'll thank the audience as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Susan. And good to see you. Thank you.